She sat on the edge of the small, creaking bed, her fingers gripping the thin, tattered bedsheet beneath her. The room was dim, the single bulb overhead flickering, as if deciding whether to stay alive or surrender to the darkness. Shadows stretched across the walls, silent witnesses to the weight pressing down on her. Her breath came slow, measured, as if the air itself was too thick to inhale. The mirror before her, a cracked, dirty piece of glass nailed unevenly to the wall, reflected a stranger, a girl with hollow eyes, dark circles etched deep beneath them. A face too young to look so exhausted, yet too aged to belong to a 19-year-old. She stared at herself, waiting, perhaps for an explanation, perhaps for a shred of familiarity. But there was nothing, no answers, just an empty gaze staring back at her. This was Rachel, retired at 19. Retired from what? From a life she never imagined she would live. A life, she swore once upon a time, she would never even glance at. Her fingers twitched at the memory. The first time. The moment she had let it all slip away. The moment she had told herself just this once. She almost laughed at the foolishness of it. Just once had turned into 1,000 times. Into a routine. Into survival. Her eyes darted to the small plastic bag on the nightstand, its contents spilling slightly onto the wooden surface. Wads of crumpled Naira notes, enough to last a while, but not enough to make her forget. Money always came, but it never stayed. It was a currency of pain, passing from one hand to another, exchanged for pieces of herself she could never reclaim. A chill ran through her. Not from the air. No, the night was warm, suffocatingly so, but from the realization that no matter how many times she told herself she was done, the past had a way of clawing back into her mind. There was no escape. Not really. She shifted slightly, the mattress groaning beneath her weight. Outside the open window, the faint sounds of a distant generator hummed, a reminder that life continued beyond these four walls, that people lived and laughed and breathed without the burden pressing against their chest like she did now. Had she ever been one of them? A girl with a clear heart, a hopeful mind, a belief in good things? She used to be. She used to believe in God and family, in the warmth of a home filled with laughter. But that was a different life, a different world. One where she was simply Rachel, the fifth child in a family of 10. The girl with big dreams and little means to achieve them. Now, she was something else. Something broken. Her hand reached out before she could stop it, trembling as her fingers traced the reflection in the mirror. The crack in the glass ran straight through her face, splitting her in two. A cruel irony, really. Because that's exactly how she felt. Divided. Torn between who she had been and what she had become. The memories came uninvited, sharp and relentless. The first time she stepped into that world. The first time she lay beneath a stranger's touch. The first time she ignored the warning screams in her mind. Regret was a funny thing. It never came before the mistake. Only after, when it was too late to turn back. Her lips parted, dry and chapped. She wanted to say something, anything. But what was there to say? That she was sorry. That she wished she had listened. That she wished she could rewind time and slap the foolish girl who thought she could handle it. The clock ticked. Slow, steady, mocking. Another night had come and gone, and she was still here, still breathing, still carrying the weight of it all. The sound of a soft knock at the door made her jump slightly. Her body tensed, instinctively bracing for something. But nothing followed. No voice, no demand. Just silence. She exhaled, the breath shaky. No one was coming. No one was looking for her. Not anymore. She was invisible now. The men who had once chased her, who had once begged for her attention, had moved on. Found fresher bodies, younger souls to taint. That's how it worked. There was always another. always someone new. Her time was up. She had given too much, lost too much. And now there was nothing left to take. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, fingers pressing against her temples. The pressure built, an ache deep inside her skull. A pounding that wasn't just from exhaustion. Sleep wouldn't come tonight. Not like it hadn't the night before, or the night before that. Because when the world went silent, the voices got louder. The whispers of the past, the ghosts of the choices she had made, the echoes of laughter from a girl who no longer existed. She squeezed her eyes shut. But the images were clearer in the darkness. The first time she wore something short, something tight, something that made her feel like she was someone else, someone confident, someone powerful. The first time she walked into a hotel, head held high, but heart hammering inside her chest. The first time she looked at the money in her hands and told herself, "This is worth it," lies, all of it. But she had believed them. She had swallowed them whole, let them settle inside her until they became the only truth she knew. Her breath shuddered, her hands curled into fists. She wanted to scream, to break something, to undo it all. But the past was not a thing one could rewrite. It was carved into her, permanent as scars on skin. Her gaze lifted to the mirror once more. The cracked reflection stared back at her. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel it. The grief, the anger, the shame. Her lips trembled. And then, finally, she whispered the words that had haunted her for so long. Words only the walls could hear. "I don't know who I am anymore." Silence. Not even the clock dared to respond. She sat there, waiting. But no answer came. There was only the quiet. And the weight of everything she had lost. She wasn't always like this. There was a time when the weight on her shoulders was lighter, when she didn't carry the shame of a past that haunted her every breath. There was a time when her name, Rachel, was just that, a name, not a story filled with regrets. She had once been part of something bigger, a family, a noisy, chaotic, sometimes overwhelming family of 10, a family that struggled, but still held on to hope. Rachel closed her eyes, letting the memories pull her back. The small, overcrowded house where she had grown up, where laughter and hunger lived side by side, where love existed, but so did exhaustion. The house was always full, full of voices, full of hands reaching for food, full of bodies packed into every available space. She had 5 younger siblings, 3 older ones, and in the center of it all, her parents. Her mother was a strong woman, the kind of woman who never rested. She was always cooking, always cleaning, always making sure everyone had what they needed, even when there wasn't enough. Her father, he was quieter, a man of few words, but the kind whose presence alone commanded respect. He worked from dawn to dusk, breaking his back just to make sure there was food on the table. Food that never seemed to be enough. Rachel could still remember the nights she went to bed with an empty stomach, listening to the soft whispers of her parents in the next room, the stress in their voices, the way her mother's tone would rise, pleading, the way her father would sigh, draculated. Money was a problem. It was always a problem. 10 people in one house, surviving on a single man's income. It didn't take much for things to spiral. The electricity would be cut off for weeks at a time. Water, when it ran, was rationed. New clothes were a luxury, so she wore what her older siblings had outgrown. And yet, in the midst of it all, they found ways to be happy. She could still hear the laughter of her younger siblings, playing outside in the dirt, the sound of old gospel music playing from her mother's small, battered radio, the warmth of morning prayers, all of them kneeling, eyes closed, listening to their father's voice as he called upon God to provide. Faith was the foundation of their home. Her mother, in particular, believed in God with an unshakable certainty. She would always say, Rachel, no matter how hard things get, never forget who you are. You are a child of God, a queen. Carry yourself like one. She had believed those words once. Believed them when she stood in front of the congregation every Sunday, reciting Bible verses with pride. Believed them when she closed her eyes at night, whispering her own prayers, asking God to make things better. She had been a good girl. A girl who did her chores without being asked twice. A girl who studied hard, even though she knew education alone wouldn't change her family's situation overnight. A girl who believed that one day, life would be different. But faith did not fill empty stomachs. Prayers did not make school fees appear out of thin air. And love, no matter how deep, did not erase the desperation that came with poverty. She remembered the first time she truly understood what it meant to be poor. It was the day she came home from school to find her mother sitting outside, her head in her hands, tears slipping silently down her face. Rachel had never seen her mother cry before, not like that. She had rushed to her side, heart pounding. "Mama, what happened?" Her mother had taken a shuddering breath, wiping her face with the back of her palm. "They sent your brother home today," she whispered. "No school fees. I begged them, Rachel. I begged them to give us more time, but they said no." Her brother had been standing nearby, his small shoulders slumped, his uniform dusty from the long walk home. And at that moment, something inside Rachel shifted. She had always known that money was a problem, but that day she understood the weight of it. The helplessness. The way it stole dignity. The way it made even the strongest people bow under its burden. That was the first time she wondered if life would ever be fair, if there was a way out, if she could ever have the things she longed for without feeling the constant ache of lack. Her older sister, Grace, had found her crying in their room later that night. "Rachel, you're too young to worry like this." But how could she not worry? She was 14 then, old enough to see what her parents were going through, old enough to know that things weren't getting better. And it wasn't just the school fees. It was everything. The clothes she hated wearing because they made her look poor. The whispers at school, when the other girls talked about new shoes, new phones, things she could never dream of owning, the hunger. The nights spent staring at the ceiling, stomach twisted in pain, waiting for sleep to take away the ache. She started to resent it. Resent the struggle. Resent the way her parents suffered, the way they kept saying God will provide when it was clear that no help was coming. Resent the way poverty clung to her skin, no matter how much she tried to shake it off. That was the beginning, the first crack in the foundation of who she was. She didn't know it then, but that moment, watching her mother cry, feeling the weight of everything they lacked, was the start of a path that would lead her to places she never imagined she would go. A path that would steal her innocence. A path that would turn her into someone she no longer recognized. A path that would one day bring her to this moment. Sitting in a dimly lit room, staring at a cracked mirror, wondering how a girl from a Christian home, a girl who once believed in purity and faith, had ended up here. She exhaled shakily, fingers curling into fists. She had wanted more, and she had found a way to get it, but at what cost? There was a time when Sundays were her favorite days, long before the weight of the world settled on her shoulders, before the hunger for more clouded her judgment, before she knew what it felt like to be touched by hands that did not love her. Rachel had been a church girl. She wasn't just any church girl. She was the kind who knew every hymn by heart, the kind who stood at the front during Sunday school, reciting Bible verses with confidence while the congregation clapped and nodded in approval. The kind who truly believed that a life of obedience and faith was all she needed to walk the right path. She could still hear the echoes of the past, the way her father's voice would rise in morning prayers, firm and commanding, as if he could single-handedly summon heaven's blessings upon their struggling family. Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for the breath in our lungs. We may not have riches, but we have you, and that is enough. Enough. Her father always said that God was enough, that love was enough, that faith was enough. She had believed it, too. She had believed it when she stood in their small church, dressed in her simple white and blue choir robe, singing with all the passion in her young heart. She had believed it when she saw her mother kneeling in prayer, eyes closed tightly, hands trembling as she whispered to God for provision. She had believed it when she walked to school with worn-out sandals, head held high, refusing to let the whispers of classmates shake her faith. She had believed that God saw her, that He heard her, that He would lift her from the struggles of their overcrowded home, that He had something better planned for her future. After all, wasn't she one of the good ones? She obeyed her parents. She helped her mother with the chores. She prayed. She read her Bible every night, tracing the words with her fingers, letting them sink into her heart. "For I know the plans I have for you," she would whisper to herself, quoting Jeremiah 29:11. "Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." That verse had been her anchor, her reminder that no matter how hard life got, something better was waiting for her, that all she had to do was hold on. But belief was a fragile thing, and dreams, no matter how big, could only survive so much hunger, so much lack, so much longing. She had wanted more, and slowly, that desire had begun to eat away at the foundation of everything she once held dear. It started as a whisper, a small, nagging thought at the back of her mind. Why must I suffer? Why do some people have everything while we have nothing? Why should I keep waiting for a future that may never come? She would push the thoughts away, force herself to kneel at the altar, to bow her head in prayer. Lord, help me be patient. Help me trust you. But doubt was like a seed. Once planted, it only needed time to grow. And it grew, slowly, quietly, until it became too loud to ignore. She still went to church, still lifted her hands in worship, still sang in the choir, her voice as pure and clear as ever. But something inside her had shifted. She began to notice things she never paid attention to before, like the way some of the older girls in church had expensive shoes, the kind she had only seen in magazines. Like the way Sister Rita, barely 22, came to church in a different outfit every Sunday, her nails perfectly done, her perfume rich and expensive. Like the way Pastor's wife always had a new handbag, the kind her mother could never dream of affording, even after years of saving. She started to wonder, started to question. Does God really bless everyone equally? Or does He have favorites? The whispers in her mind grew louder, and then came the comparisons. She had always believed that purity was a gift, that waiting until marriage was the honorable thing to do. But some of the girls at school, girls who did not pray like she did, girls who did not fast like she did, girls who laughed when she spoke about faith, seemed to be living better lives. They had new clothes. They had the latest phones. They had men who adored them, who bought them things, who made them feel special. And what did she have? A Bible full of promises that had yet to come true, a home where food was never enough, a mother who cried behind closed doors, a father who sighed with the weight of a burden he could not carry. One day, during youth fellowship, she overheard a conversation that would plant the final seed of doubt. "Rachel," Sophia had said, leaning in with a knowing smile, "you're too pretty to be suffering like this." It was a simple statement, but it cracked something inside her. Because it was true, she was tired of suffering, tired of waiting, tired of believing that things would change when deep down, she wasn't sure they ever would. She had dreams, big dreams. Dreams of traveling, of wearing beautiful dresses, of living in a house with air conditioning, of never having to worry about money again. And suddenly, the life she had always known, the prayers, the fasting, the worship, felt so small she wanted more. And she was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to get it. Why is it that some people do everything right, yet nothing changes for them? Do you believe faith alone is enough to change someone's life? Has there ever been a time when you questioned everything you believed in? What do you think pushes people to make choices they once swore they never would? Have you ever felt like life was unfair to you, even when you did everything right? She never thought she would be the kind of girl who second-guessed everything she had been taught. She had grown up believing in right and wrong, in clear lines that should never be crossed. But now those lines were blurring. It started subtly. A thought here, a curiosity there, a lingering glance at things she knew she shouldn't want. It began with Sophia. Sophia was different, confident, bold, and effortlessly glamorous. She moved through life like someone who had figured out a secret no one else knew. She was never in a hurry, never desperate, never worried. And she always had money. Real money. Not the crumpled Naira notes Rachel's mother counted so carefully, stretching them to cover food, school fees, and bills that never seemed to end. No, Sophia had crisp, fresh notes, the kind that smelled of power and ease. The first time Rachel saw Sophia casually pull out a stack of cash, her stomach twisted with something she didn't want to name. Jealousy, envy, desire. "Where do you even get all this money from?" she had asked one afternoon, watching Sophia count her cash. Sophia had only smiled, a slow, knowing smile, as if the question itself was naive. "Rachel, there are ways. You just have to know how to play the game." The game. Rachel didn't ask that day what the game was. She wasn't sure she wanted to know, but the question lingered in her mind, long after she went home, long after she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why some girls had everything while others, no matter how hard they prayed, had nothing. Then came the first invitation, a birthday party. Nothing serious, just a small get-together at a friend's house. "You never do anything fun," Sophia teased, nudging her playfully. "You're always in church or at home. You need to loosen up a little." Rachel hesitated. She wasn't the kind of girl who went to parties. She wasn't the kind of girl who stayed out late. But something inside her, a restless, aching part of her, wanted to see what it was like. Just once. Just to see. So she said yes. She should have said no. She should have walked away, but she didn't. The night of the party, she felt strange in her own skin. The dress Sophia had lent her was tighter than anything she had ever worn before. The heels felt unsteady beneath her feet. She barely recognized herself. When they arrived, the house was already packed. Music pulsed through the walls, thick and heavy, the kind that made the air vibrate. Laughter spilled from every corner. Girls dressed in silk and glitter lounged on leather couches, sipping drinks that smelled unfamiliar. Rachel felt out of place, but no one else seemed to notice. "Relax," Sophia whispered, pressing a cold glass into her hand. "Just enjoy yourself." She stared at the drink. She shouldn't. She knew she shouldn't. But Sophia's voice was warm, reassuring. And deep down, she wanted to forget for a little while. So she took a sip. It burned. Her throat, her chest, her stomach. It all felt like fire. But then, warmth spread through her, dulling the edges of her unease. The world didn't feel so sharp anymore. She laughed when Sophia laughed. She nodded along to the music. She let herself be pulled into conversations with people whose names she wouldn't remember. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't the poor girl. She wasn't the one people pitied. She was just Rachel, and she liked it. She didn't even notice when someone took her hand and led her away from the crowd. She barely processed the moment she found herself alone in a dimly lit room, the door clicking shut behind her. Her pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. The man before her was older. Too old. His smile was easy, practiced. A voice in her head screamed at her to leave, to run. But she couldn't move. Her body felt sluggish, her thoughts hazy. He reached out, his fingers grazing her arm. Her stomach lurched. She should say something. She should stop this, but she didn't. Not because she wanted it, no, never that. But because she didn't know how to say no. Because she had come here willingly. Because she had taken the drink, let herself be led away, ignored every warning in her head. She had no one to blame but herself. The night passed in a blur. She barely remembered leaving, barely remembered Sophia's arm around her, whispering, "It's okay, Rachel. It happens. It happens," as if that made it better. As if that erased the shame curling inside her, like something rotten. The next morning, she woke up with a pounding headache and a weight on her chest she couldn't shake. She told herself it was a mistake, a one-time thing, something she would never do again. But the damage had already been done. The door had been opened, and once open, some doors are impossible to close. Have you ever done something you swore you never would? Do you think one small compromise can change the course of someone's life? What do you think was going through Rachel's mind the moment she realized she had made a mistake? How much pressure do you think society places on young girls to have a certain kind of lifestyle? If you were in Rachel's position, what would you have done differently? It was just one night. That was what she told herself. One night to feel something different. One night to forget the life she had. One night that changed everything. The invitation came casually, almost as if it was an afterthought. Sophia had leaned against Rachel's desk at school, twirling a pen between her fingers. "Friday night," she said, voice light, eyes sharp. "We're going out again." Rachel hesitated. The last time had been confusing. She had woken up feeling hollow, a strange mix of regret and something else she couldn't name. But Sophia had acted like nothing had happened, as if that night had been normal. Maybe it was. Maybe Rachel was the one making it into something bigger than it was. Still, something inside her resisted. "I don't think I should," Sophia scoffed. "Oh, come on, you think too much." She tilted her head, studying her. "You had fun, didn't you?" Had she? She had laughed. She had danced. She had felt free, at least for a while. And that feeling was addicting. So she said yes, again. And just like that, she sealed her fate. Friday night came too quickly. The dress Sophia had picked out for her was even tighter than the last one. The heels even taller. The makeup heavier. She barely recognized the girl staring back at her in the mirror. But that was the point, wasn't it? To become someone else. Someone who didn't worry. Someone who didn't overthink. Someone who knew how to have fun. By the time they arrived at the club, the music was already shaking the walls. Neon lights pulsed in the darkness, flashing against bodies pressed together on the dance floor. Rachel swallowed hard. It felt different this time. The first time had been an experiment, a step into the unknown. But this felt like a choice. She let Sophia drag her inside. Let the heat of the club wrap around her. Let the bass thrum through her bones. The world blurred. A drink was pressed into her hand. She drank it without thinking. Another, then another. The edges of reality softened. Somewhere in the haze, she felt hands on her waist, guiding her to the dance floor. The deep laugh in her ear, the scent of expensive cologne. She should have been afraid, but she wasn't, not yet. That came later, much later. At some point, she realized she was no longer with Sophia. She turned, scanning the crowd, but the faces blurred together. She should have left then, should have pushed her way out, called a cab, gone home. But instead, she felt a hand on her arm, a voice, smooth, persuasive. Looking for someone? She turned. The man was older, dressed well, a confidence in his stance that made her uneasy. She took a step back. I should go. He smiled, easy and practiced. Stay a little longer. I'll make sure you get home safe. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down her spine. Her body screamed at her to leave, but her mind whispered, don't be rude, don't overreact. Just one more drink. So she stayed. The room was spinning. When had that happened? She blinked, trying to focus. Where was she? She wasn't in the club anymore. The air was cooler, the music distant. She turned her head. A hotel room, panic slammed into her chest. How had she gotten here? She struggled to sit up, her limbs sluggish, her thoughts foggy. Memories flashed, his hand on her waist, his voice in her ear, his arm around her shoulder as he led her outside. Led her here. She gasped. No. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her head spinning. She needed to leave. Now the door opened. He was there. A slow smile spread across his face. You're awake. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled. His eyes darkened. Relax, he said, stepping closer. She backed up. I need to go. The smile didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. Go? He chuckled. After everything? Her stomach twisted. What did he mean? She shook her head. I don't remember. That's okay, he interrupted smoothly. I do. Her pulse roared in her ears. Number. This wasn't happening. She had let it happen once before that first night. The mistake she never spoke of. But this was different. She hadn't chosen this, had she? A flash of memory, his hand passing her another drink, his fingers brushing against hers. A sick realization crawled over her skin. She had been too drunk, too out of it. And he had known. She took another step back, but he reached for her wrist, holding it firmly. Don't be difficult, he murmured. Her breath caught. Fear slammed into her so fast, so hard, she couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed at her to run. But how? He was stronger, bigger. The door was behind him. She was trapped. Panic made her body tremble. She had never felt this kind of fear before, not even the first time. This was different. This was pure helplessness. A tear slipped down her cheek. His grip tightened. Then, a knock, loud, sharp, a voice. Sir, your time is up. For a second, neither of them moved. Then slowly, his fingers loosened. The moment she was free, she bolted. She barely registered the hotel staff in the hallway, their curious stares as she ran past them. She didn't stop running, not until she was outside, gulping in air, her body shaking so violently she could barely hold herself upright. Her phone buzzed, a message from Sophia. Where are you? She stared at the screen, chest heaving. She wanted to tell her everything, wanted to scream, cry. But instead, she typed back one word, leaving. Then she turned and disappeared into the night. She never spoke about that night. Not to Sophia, not to herself. She buried it deep, locking it away in a part of her mind she never visited. Because admitting it, facing it, meant accepting what she had become. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Have you ever ignored your instincts and regretted it? Do you think Rachel's silence was a form of self-protection or denial? What would you say to someone who has been in a situation like this? How much responsibility does society place on young girls to handle themselves in dangerous situations? If you were in Rachel's shoes, what would you have done next? Faint, haunting background music, footsteps on a tiled floor, a phone notification sound. The next few weeks felt like an endless blur. She should have told someone, should have reached out to Sophia, to her parents, to anyone who might have listened. But she didn't. Instead, Rachel buried the memory deep within herself, just as she had done after the first night. It was easier that way, less painful. She didn't want to admit how far she had fallen. She didn't want to see the disappointment in her mother's eyes, or the judgment in her father's face. So, she kept it to herself. The man from that night had vanished from her thoughts for a while. She didn't think about him much. It wasn't his face that haunted her. It was the shame that gripped her chest every time she looked in the mirror. The shame of knowing she had let it happen. The shame of being a part of something she never thought she would be. But soon, something else began to take over her. The craving for more. The taste of a different life. One where she wasn't just the girl from a poor family. The one who had to make do with secondhand clothes and hand-me-down shoes. She had seen what could be had when you played the game. She had felt the rush of spending money like it was nothing, of being desired, of being wanted. That rush, how could she ignore it? Her phone buzzed one evening after school. A message from an unknown number. "Looking for a job? Call me. I have something that will change your life." She stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. But then the thought entered her mind. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is the way out. She had no idea who the message was from, but she was so desperate to get away from her life, to get away from the guilt that threatened to drown her, that she didn't think twice. She called. The voice on the other end was smooth, confident, and unfamiliar. "Hello, Rachel," the voice greeted, its tone almost too familiar. "I hear you're looking for a change." I don't know," she stammered, unsure of what she was even asking for. "I saw your message. What is this about?" There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "It's simple, really. I know someone who can make your dreams come true. All you need to do is meet him." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. I'm not sure." The voice was patient, almost coaxing. "Listen, sweetheart. There's nothing to be afraid of. If you want a better life, you have to take a chance. I can make sure you get what you deserve. But you have to trust me." Trust him? It was the word she'd heard too many times, spoken by people who always seemed to have ulterior motives. But this time there was something different. Something in her stomach stirred. What was the worst that could happen? So, she agreed to meet him. That was the first step into the double life she would begin to lead. The night they met, she was nervous. She had been given an address, a location in the city far away from the quiet streets she knew. A nice part of town, expensive shops, big cars, streetlights that never seemed to dim. Rachel took a deep breath as she stepped out of the taxi, looking up at the tall building in front of her. This was the kind of place she had only ever seen in movies. The kind of place where people dressed in suits and walked with purpose, where everyone seemed to belong except for her. She had never felt more out of place. She entered the building with hesitant steps, her heart racing. The lobby was polished, sparkling under the harsh lights. A receptionist gave her a curious glance, but didn't ask any questions. She was ushered into a private elevator, the doors closing silently behind her. Up she went. The elevator dinged when it reached the top floor, and Rachel stepped out, her knees suddenly feeling weak. She wasn't sure why she felt so afraid, but she couldn't ignore the sensation that something was wrong. Before she could second-guess herself, a door opened, and a man stepped into view. He was older, mid-30s maybe, with sharp eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach his lips. His clothes were expensive, tailored, and he radiated power in a way that made her uneasy. "Rachel," he said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "Come in. I've been waiting for you." She hesitated, but only for a moment before she stepped inside. The room was nothing like she had expected. It wasn't a cold corporate office, but a spacious penthouse with modern furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city. "I hope you're comfortable," the man said as he gestured to a plush chair. "Please, have a seat." She sat, trying to keep her breathing steady, trying to ignore the rising panic in her chest. "I'm Richard," he said, sitting across from her. "I know you've got questions. I'm not here to waste your time, Rachel. You're here because you want more. I can give you that. All you need to do is listen." She nodded slowly. She couldn't find the words to ask the questions that were screaming in her head. "I can offer you the lifestyle you've always dreamed of. Money, security, luxury," Richard continued, his voice almost hypnotic. "But there's a price. There always is." She didn't say anything. Richard leaned forward, his gaze intense. "What I'm offering isn't for everyone. But I think you're different. You've got what it takes to succeed in this world." Rachel shifted in her seat, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Are you in?" he asked, his eyes locking onto hers. Her heart was pounding. She didn't answer right away. She looked out of the window, trying to collect her thoughts, trying to think clearly. What if this was her way out? What if this was her chance to escape everything? She had always dreamed of a better life, of stepping away from the poverty and the struggle. And here it was, right in front of her. Her mind raced. What was the worst that could happen? She looked back at Richard, nodded, and said the words she would later regret. "I'm in." From that moment on, Rachel's life became a carefully crafted lie. She would go to school during the day, pretend like everything was normal, like she was still that innocent church girl with big dreams. But as soon as night fell, her double life began. Richard kept his promises for a while. He introduced her to men who could offer her the life she wanted: luxury, comfort, and power. They didn't call her anything else but a companion. But Rachel knew the truth. She had become something she never thought she would be, and she hated herself for it. But the money was too tempting, the lifestyle too addictive. Every time she stepped into a new world, she told herself it was the last time. But deep down, she knew she was lying. How could she stop now? She had already crossed too many lines, and it was too late to turn back. Have you ever made a decision in the heat of the moment that changed your life forever? What do you think makes people choose paths they know will hurt them in the end? Do you think the temptation of money and luxury can outweigh the moral compass someone once had? What do you think it takes to live a double life without completely losing yourself? If you were in Rachel's shoes, would you have chosen the same path? The first time she realized the full weight of the world she had entered, it wasn't during the night of seduction. It wasn't when Richard made his smooth promises, or when the luxury of the penthouse seemed to wrap her in a false sense of security. It was the first time she found herself in a hotel room, alone, waiting for a client to arrive, and everything inside her screamed, "What am I doing here?" But she didn't leave. She couldn't. The money was already on the table, literal cash in hand, folded crisp, just the way she had seen it handed to Sophia at parties, just the way she had seen the men give it to the women who glided past her on the streets. It wasn't just the money that kept her seated, waiting. It was something more insidious, a hunger, a yearning, a feeling that once she crossed this line, there was no going back. At first, it was easy to pretend that this wasn't who she was, that it was just a mistake, one she wouldn't repeat. She had told herself it was only business, a transaction, one night, one man. But in that hotel room, the moment she heard the knock on the door, something inside her faltered. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. But what choice did she have? She stood up from the edge of the bed, smoothing down her dress, trying to steady her breath. She had learned to control the shaking of her hands, the tremor that told everyone around her that she wasn't as confident as she pretended to be. But that night, That moment was different. She felt like she might fall apart right there. But before she could convince herself to leave, the knock came again. She walked toward the door, her heartbeat thumping so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself, trying to remember the words Richard had told her. "It's simple. Just let it happen. Make it look easy. You're not who you were before. You're someone new now." She inhaled deeply, opened the door, and saw him standing there, tall, imposing. He smiled at her, as if this was an everyday occurrence for him, like he had done this 100 times. And she was just another face, another body to satisfy his wants. His eyes scanned her up and down, making her skin crawl under the weight of his gaze. "Come on in," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady, despite the knot in her stomach. The room felt too small now that he was inside. She stood in the corner, trying not to shrink away as he approached the bed. He didn't look at her like a human being. He looked at her like a possession, like something to use, something to discard when he was done. Her eyes darted to the clock on the wall. There was no turning back now. "Let's make this quick," he said, his voice gruff. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a fat envelope, placing it on the nightstand. "You can keep it all. Just do your job and we're good." Rachel tried not to let her emotions show. She had heard enough of these men talking about their jobs, their services, like they were speaking about anything but the raw ugliness of what they expected from her. She had told herself 100 times that it wasn't personal, that it was just business. But it wasn't, not anymore. She forced herself to smile, the kind of smile she had practiced in front of the mirror 100 times. She had learned how to be charming, how to make them feel like they were in control, when in reality, she was the one who held all the power. But power was a lie. Power was something that these men had invented to justify their actions. They thought they owned her, thought they could buy her for the price of an envelope filled with cash. They had no idea how little their money meant to her anymore. Minutes passed, and each second seemed to stretch longer than the last. He was rough, detached, and when it was over, he didn't even look at her. He just left. Rachel lay there on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Her chest was tight, her mind swirling with confusion and shame. She had done it again and again. And this wasn't just some mistake anymore. This was who she was now. This was the life she had chosen. She had crossed the line and then crossed it again. But every time she stepped over that boundary, it became harder to see what the world looked like on the other side. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Richard. "How did it go?" "Everything smooth." Rachel stared at the words, fingers hovering over the screen. What was she supposed to say? She could tell him everything. Tell him how much she hated it. Tell him she was starting to realize she wasn't cut out for this. But the money... It was enough. The power, the control, the luxury. It all seemed so real, so promising. So she replied, "Yeah, it was fine." For a moment she thought she saw a flicker of something in her eyes, but the moment passed as quickly as it came. She had done it. And now, there was no going back. The next few weeks blurred together into a cycle of fast cars, hotel rooms, and men whose names she would never remember. She didn't think about it much anymore. She couldn't afford to. It was easier to ignore the part of herself that had once been innocent, the part that had believed in love and purity. Instead, she focused on the money, the rush, the new dresses, the shoes, the nights in hotels that were too expensive for her old life to even touch. She couldn't deny how it felt to be wanted, to feel powerful, to know she could have anything she wanted just by doing what they asked. But the harder she tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, the more it gnawed at her. The first time she looked in the mirror after a night like that, Something inside her broke. She didn't see a confident woman anymore. She saw a girl who had given everything away, piece by piece, until nothing was left. She knew she wasn't fooling anyone. She wasn't fooling herself either. But the business of the night continued. It had to. The days were simple: school, study, sleep. And then there were the nights where everything was different. Nights spent in luxury cars and penthouses. Nights where she pretended to be someone else. Someone who didn't have a past. Someone who didn't remember the girl she used to be. It was a game now, one she had no choice but to play. And the more she played, the more she lost herself in the process. The money came in fast, but it didn't last. Each new man, each new job, pushed her further into a life she had never imagined for herself. But every time she questioned it, Richard's words came back to her. "You're not who you were before. You're someone new now, someone who can get everything they want." But was she really someone new? Or had she just become a shell of who she used to be? What does it mean to sell yourself for something as fleeting as money? Can you really escape your past? Or does it always come back to haunt you? Do you think Rachel will ever realize the weight of what she's doing? What would it take for her to walk away from this life? Can someone truly change their identity? Or are we forever bound by the choices we make? The first time she heard the warning, it came from a friend, one she hadn't seen in weeks. Cynthia had been her classmate in the early years of high school, a girl with the same dreams of escaping the poverty they were both shackled to, the same ambitions of wanting something more. Cynthia had seen something in Rachel that others hadn't. She had always been the voice of reason, the one who would caution, the one who had never fully embraced the lifestyle Rachel had slowly started to slip into. But by the time Rachel heard from her again, it was too late. They were at a cafe, a place where they had once sat together during lunch breaks, laughing over petty crushes and trivial things. It had been a long time since they had shared one of those moments. Rachel had changed. She could feel it, the distance between them growing with each passing day. But when Cynthia reached out to meet her, when her old friend offered a casual "Hey, long time no see" message, Rachel was more than happy to oblige. She needed someone from her past, someone who still saw her as the girl she had been before the world had pulled her into the darkness. But as she looked across the table, something in Cynthia's eyes made her hesitate. There was concern there, hidden behind the forced smile, the same concern that had been in her voice when they first spoke after the incident that Rachel had so desperately tried to erase from her mind. Cynthia knew. She knew something had changed. "I see what you're doing, Rachel," Cynthia said quietly, taking a sip of her coffee as if it was just another casual remark. But Rachel could tell there was a sharpness in her voice, the kind that came from caring too much, from seeing someone slowly unravel in front of their eyes. "You think it's harmless, don't you? You think it's all just fun and games." Rachel's chest tightened at the words. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to mask the unease creeping over her. "You know exactly what I mean," Cynthia responded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're doing things you promised you'd never do. Things you told me weren't for you. Don't pretend like you've forgotten." Rachel tried to smile, to push the words away, to convince herself that Cynthia's concern was just a result of her overactive imagination. But deep down, Rachel knew the truth, knew that her friend could see through the mask she'd carefully crafted. "I'm not that person anymore, Cynthia," she said quietly, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. The words sounded hollow, even to her. "Things change. People change." "People change," Cynthia repeated softly, nodding slowly. "But sometimes the change isn't for the better." Her voice was low, filled with the weight of a warning Rachel wasn't sure she was ready to hear. "I'm scared for you, Rachel. You're heading down a dangerous path." "I'm fine," Rachel lied, her voice cracking. Everything's fine. But the truth was, nothing was fine. And Cynthia's words stayed with her long after they parted ways. A few days later, that same warning echoed in her mind, this time louder, sharper, as if it was the universe itself trying to make her listen. She had been out with a few men from the circles Richard had introduced her to. It was the usual routine: dinner, drinks, followed by a night at the hotel. Money exchanged hands. It was easy, almost predictable, like a dance she had learned well. But that night, there was something different. There was an unease in the air, a crackle of tension that had not been there before. It was one of the men, a businessman in his 40s, whose eyes lingered too long, whose smile held a hint of something darker. He had been kind enough at first, offering her a drink, complimenting her, pretending that this was just another normal evening out. But as the night wore on, she began to feel uncomfortable under his gaze, his touches lingering in ways that didn't feel right. There was an instinct inside her that screamed, "Leave now," but she ignored it, brushing it off like she had so many other warnings, so many other red flags that she had been blind to. After all, it was part of the job, but tonight felt different. Something felt wrong, and it wasn't just the man. No, it was the entire situation, the whole life she had chosen. She was starting to feel like she was drowning. "Relax," he murmured, noticing her stiff posture. "You're tense. Just let go, Rachel. This is what you signed up for." The words hit her like a slap. What I signed up for. She had never agreed to this, never truly accepted it. But somewhere along the way, somewhere in the thick fog of money and alcohol, she had allowed herself to slip deeper and deeper into a life she couldn't escape. Before she could make sense of it, the man leaned in too close and her body froze. She didn't move, didn't react. She just stayed still, pretending this wasn't happening, pretending she wasn't trapped in a world she didn't belong to. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the men. It was about the decisions she had made, decisions that had led her to this moment, decisions she had ignored in favor of instant gratification. She felt the chill of fear creeping in as the moment stretched on, but she pushed it down. She had to. But that night didn't end quietly. She excused herself as politely as she could, the man's eyes following her every move. The moment she stepped into the bathroom, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, breathing heavily. The silence felt deafening. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Richard. "You doing okay?" She stared at the message for a long time, her hand trembling. She wasn't okay. She hadn't been okay for a while now. But how could she tell him that? How could she explain that for the first time she was terrified of what she had become? Terrified of the life she was leading. Rachel tapped out a simple response. "Yeah, all good." She didn't know why she lied. Maybe it was easier than telling the truth. Maybe it was because she had convinced herself that this was the only way to survive, the only way to get what she wanted. But deep down, she was beginning to realize that everything she had gained came at the cost of something far more important. The next morning, Cynthia's words echoed in her mind again. This time, they felt like a slap, as if she could hear her friend's voice warning her, "This isn't who you are, Rachel." She closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples. Her mind felt heavy, full of the noise she had tried so hard to shut out. The life she had chosen was nothing like she had imagined. It was supposed to be about power, about escaping the chains of her past, about finally having what she deserved. But instead, it was becoming a prison. Another knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Her mother called that evening, her voice warm, but laced with something else, a concern Rachel had learned to ignore for so long. "Rachel," her mother began, the tone in her voice suggesting she knew something was wrong. Are you all right? I've been hearing things. People have been talking, sweetheart. People at church, at the store, even your old friends." Rachel swallowed hard. How could she know? Her mother's voice softened. "I just want you to be careful. Your father and I are worried. I know you're trying to make something of yourself, but remember who you are. Remember where you came from. You're a queen, Rachel. You've always been a queen. Don't forget that." For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a sting in her eyes, the tears threatening to spill over. The words her mother had once spoken to her as a child, words she had long discarded, suddenly felt like a weight on her heart. She wanted to tell her mother everything. She wanted to tell her that she was so lost, so far from the girl she had been. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she muttered something about being fine and ended the call quickly, unable to face the reality of the woman she had become. Can we really ignore the warnings in our lives without paying the price? Have you ever felt the fear creeping in, only to push it away because you didn't want to face the truth? What does it take to realize that you've gone too far down a path to turn back? Why do we sometimes let ourselves get lost in something we know will hurt us? Rachel had never thought she would reach this point. Not like this. Not when everything she had worked for, the clothes, the nights in fancy hotels, the men who whispered promises in her ear, seemed to crumble away with each passing day. But the harder she tried to hold on to it, to make herself believe that it was worth it, the more the life she had built on lies and compromises began to unravel. It was just one phone call. One call that changed everything. It came in the middle of the night, a time when she should have been asleep, when the world was quiet, and she was alone with her thoughts. It was Richard, his voice as calm as ever, but something in it, something she couldn't place, sent a chill through her. "Rachel, I need you to come meet me," Richard said, his words steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency she hadn't heard before. "It's important." Her stomach dropped. It wasn't like Richard to call her at this hour, not unless something serious had happened, and for the first time, she felt the cold touch of fear slide down her spine. I'm not sure. It's late, Richard," she said, trying to mask the unease that had settled in her chest. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, but now everything felt wrong. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't urgent," he pressed, his tone soft, almost persuasive. "Trust me, it's something you need to know." "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words escaped her before she could even think them through. She couldn't explain why she agreed so quickly. Maybe it was the tension in his voice. Maybe it was the gnawing sense that something was coming, that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She stood up from her bed, feeling as if the room was closing in around her. Her legs felt unsteady as she grabbed her jacket, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. What had happened? What had changed? The city streets outside were dark and quiet as she stepped into the night. The usual buzz of life that normally filled the air had vanished, leaving only the distant hum of traffic and the occasional sound of a dog barking in the distance. It was the kind of night where the world felt still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. She drove in a daze, not quite sure what to expect, but knowing that whatever was waiting for her would change everything. By the time she reached the address Richard had given her hands were clammy, her mind racing. When she entered the dimly lit room, the first thing she noticed was the heaviness in the air, the tension that filled every corner. Richard was there, sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the dark skyline. His usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something Rachel couldn't quite read. "Sit down," he said, without turning to look at her. Rachel hesitated for a moment before taking the seat across from him. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her fingers itching with the need to ask questions, but she didn't. She waited. Finally, Richard spoke. "Cynthia's dead." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Cynthia?" she echoed, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. Her mind tried to process the words, but they felt like they didn't belong together. Cynthia, the girl who had been her closest friend, her confidant, the girl who had warned her, who had begged her to turn away from this life. Dead? The words felt like a cruel joke, but Richard wasn't smiling. "Number, this isn't a joke," he said, his voice low, devoid of the usual confidence that had always surrounded him. "She's dead, Rachel. And I—" He paused, then seemed to catch himself. He turned to face her, his eyes dark, full of something she couldn't place. "I had no choice. You have to understand that." "Had no choice," Rachel repeated, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you talking about? What happened to her?" Richard sighed, running a hand over his face, his usual calm demeanor shattered. "She got too deep, Rachel. Too deep into the game. She started getting sloppy, started talking to people she shouldn't have. She got too comfortable, too reckless." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "One of her clients didn't take kindly to that." Rachel stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. The words didn't make sense. She couldn't breathe. Cynthia, her friend, her only real friend in this world, gone. A memory of the last time she had seen Cynthia flashed in her mind. Cynthia's concerned look, her warnings. She had tried to help her, had tried to pull her out of this world. But it hadn't been enough. None of it had been enough. "I tried to stop it," Richard continued, his voice growing quieter. "But she didn't listen. She kept going, kept putting herself in danger." He looked at Rachel, his eyes hard, and there was a coldness there that unsettled her. "You're walking a fine line too, Rachel. I can't protect you if you keep making mistakes like this." Rachel's heart thundered in her chest. Her mind was spinning, caught between disbelief and fear. She couldn't wrap her head around what Richard was saying. Cynthia had always been so careful, so cautious. She had been the one to warn her, the one who had been afraid of what might happen, and now she was gone. Rachel closed her eyes, swallowing hard as the tears threatened to spill over. Why had she ignored the warnings? Why hadn't she listened? Her friend had been right all along. The moment she stepped into this world, she had crossed a line she couldn't come back from. And now it had cost Cynthia her life. A chilling realization hit her like a wave. She wasn't safe anymore. She had never been safe. She opened her eyes and looked at Richard, her voice hoarse. "What are you saying? What do you want from me?" He leaned forward, his expression grim. "I want you to understand the reality of what you're involved in. You're in this now, Rachel. You can't back out. And if you keep making mistakes like Cynthia did, you're going to end up just like her. Do you understand?" Her body went cold at his words. The weight of his words crushed her chest. Just like Cynthia, she had warned herself. She had heard the voices, Sophia's, Cynthia's, even her own conscience, but she had ignored them. She had thought she was different, thought she could control it. But now, she was staring at the truth that had been there all along, hiding in the shadows, waiting for her to face it. Rachel stood up suddenly, her legs shaking beneath her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't do this anymore." But Richard's voice stopped her. "You're already in, Rachel. There's no turning back, not now." She ran out of the room, her breath coming in short gasps as she stumbled down the hallway. Her heart pounded in her ears, her mind swirling with the truth she had just uncovered. She had ignored the warnings. She had ignored the signs. And now, someone was dead because of it. She stumbled into the night air, the cold hitting her skin like a slap, but she couldn't feel it. She couldn't feel anything. She was numb. As she walked down the empty street, tears streamed down her face. She couldn't stop them. She couldn't stop the flood of emotions threatening to drown her. Cynthia was gone, and it was her fault. The realization crushed her. What happens when you reach the point of no return? Is it ever too late to turn back after you've crossed the line? Have you ever ignored the warnings of someone you loved and lost something precious because of it? The moment she stepped away from Richard's office, the weight of everything hit her in waves. The promise of a life she had tasted, a life that glittered with wealth, power, and temporary escapes from the harsh realities of her past, seemed so distant now. The man she had once been, the girl who had grown up with hope and faith, was so far gone that it felt as if she were a stranger to herself. Yet in the quiet of the night, in the silence of her own thoughts, she knew one undeniable truth. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't ignore the hollow ache in her chest. She couldn't pretend that the life she was leading was worth it when all it brought was emptiness, loneliness, and fear. Fear that one day she would meet the same fate as Cynthia, her old friend, who had been swallowed by this world. Fear that she was already too deep, that there was no way out. Fear that she had lost the chance to return to the life she once knew. The life that had seemed so simple compared to the chaos she was now trapped in. But even as she felt that fear rising, she knew she had to try. The apartment she called home now felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The once familiar walls, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the half-empty bookshelves seemed to mock her, as though they were reminding her of everything she had lost in the pursuit of something she never truly wanted. The decision to leave had been building in her for days. The phone calls from Richard were becoming more insistent, each one pushing her further into a corner she could no longer avoid. He had warned her already that walking away wasn't an option, that once you were in, there was no leaving. He'd made it clear that she owed him now, and she didn't know if that was a debt she could ever repay. But that night, she had made her decision. Rachel grabbed her jacket and threw it over her shoulders. She wasn't sure what she expected when she left, what she would find when she walked out of this life. But she couldn't stay, not any longer. The money, the luxury, the men. They had never filled the hole inside her. They had never healed the wounds from her past, from the family she had abandoned, from the girl who had once dreamed of a life of purity and faith. Those dreams had crumbled piece by piece, and she had watched it happen, unable to stop herself. As she walked to the door, her phone buzzed. It was Richard. She hesitated for a moment before answering, knowing that her actions would now have consequences. She didn't want to hear his voice, didn't want to listen to his manipulations anymore. But she had to. She had to end this. Rachel, Richard's voice greeted her coolly. There was no warmth in it, no affection, just the familiar sharp edge that made her stomach tighten. I thought you understood the rules. I thought you knew what this was. You're not walking away from me. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I don't care about the rules anymore, Richard. I'm done. I'm done with you, with this life. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then his voice came back, low and dangerous. You can't walk away from this. Not after everything you've done. You owe me, Rachel. You've made your choices and now you're stuck with them. His words hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She had heard the threats before, heard the promises of what would happen if she tried to leave. But she was tired. Tired of living in fear, tired of constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if today would be the day she'd finally be caught up in the mess she had created for herself. I'm not afraid of you anymore, she said, her voice shaking slightly. but still resolute. "I'm done. I'm leaving, and you can't stop me." She ended the call before he could say anything else. Rachel walked to the bus stop, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't slow down. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay here. She had no plan, no destination, just a desperate need to escape. The city felt too big now, too unfamiliar. She had once walked these streets with a sense of belonging, but now each step felt heavy, as though the weight of her decisions was pulling her down. As she waited for the bus, a thought crossed her mind. What if it was too late? What if Richard's words were true and she had no way out of this life? But she couldn't afford to think that way. She couldn't let fear dictate her choices anymore. She had lived in fear long enough. The bus arrived and she climbed aboard, the doors closing behind her with a soft hiss. As the bus pulled away, she looked out the window, watching the city blur around her. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to keep moving. If she stopped, she was afraid she might fall back into the same old patterns, the same familiar trap. She needed a fresh start. When the bus finally stopped at her destination, Rachel found herself standing in front of a small, run-down apartment building on the outskirts of the city. It was nothing like the luxurious places she had been used to, the ones with marble floors, high-end furniture, and a constant stream of guests who came and went like clockwork. But it was safe. It was anonymous. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like a place where she could breathe. She didn't have a lot of money, but she had enough to get by for now. Enough to make it through the next few weeks, maybe longer if she found a job. She had to start over. She had to find a way to rebuild her life, even if it meant starting from scratch. The building itself was old, the paint peeling from the walls, and the stairwell dimly lit. But it felt like a sanctuary compared to the life she had just walked away from. She rented a small apartment on the second floor, one that had barely enough room for a bed and a small table. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had a space of her own, a place where she could try to put the pieces of herself back together. As she settled into her new place, the silence around her was deafening. She had spent so many months in the noise of clubs, hotel rooms, and crowded streets that the quiet felt almost alien. For the first time in a long time, she had no one to answer to, no phone calls to return, no messages to respond to. There was no Richard waiting for her to fall back in line, no men expecting her to show up and do her job. She could finally breathe, but it wasn't easy. Every night the emptiness crept in. It was in the way she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the sound of money being passed into her hands, the feel of hands that weren't her own, the eyes of men who didn't see her as a person, but as an object. The loneliness hit her hard. The desire to go back to that life, to feel wanted again, was a constant temptation, but she fought it. Every time she thought about picking up the phone and calling Richard, every time she thought about going back to the life that had given her everything she thought she wanted, she stopped herself. She had made a promise to herself, and this time she was determined to keep it. Weeks passed, and the routine of her new life began to settle in. She found a job as a waitress at a small diner, working long hours for little pay. But it was honest work. It was a way out. She had to remind herself of that every day. The guilt still gnawed at her, especially when she thought about Cynthia, about the choices she had made that led to her friend's death. But she had to keep moving forward. She couldn't let herself drown in the past. She needed to survive. One evening, as she sat in the small apartment, sorting through the pile of bills that had started to accumulate, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number. "I'm still watching you, Rachel. You can't run from this. You belong to me." Her hands shook as she read the message. She had been waiting for this moment, had known it was coming. The moment Richard would find her, the moment he would pull her back into the life she had worked so hard to leave. But this time, she wouldn't let it break her. She couldn't go back. The weeks had passed like a river, each one flowing into the next, smooth and uninterrupted. But the current never ceased to tug at Rachel's heart, always pulling her back into the past she could never fully escape. Every day was a battle. She had made the decision to leave, had walked away from the promises, from the temptations of the world she had known. But that didn't make it easy. She still woke up with the same aching loneliness, still felt the pull of the money, the luxury, the men who had once adored her, who had once needed her. It was easy to convince herself that she was better off, that the quiet of her new life was the life she had fought for. But the truth was much more complicated. She wasn't happy, not really. The small apartment, the endless hours at the diner, the sparse meals, the isolation. Nothing in her life now could replace what she had left behind. She had spent so long chasing something she thought would make her whole, only to find herself emptier than ever. The silence of her apartment was both a gift and a curse. It gave her space to breathe, but it also left her with too much time to think, too much time to remember. And then there were the nights. Those quiet nights where her past seemed to creep up behind her, shadows slipping beneath the door. It was in those moments when the darkness felt all-consuming, and she would lie awake in the small bed, trying to remember who she was before all of this. But the memories never stayed in the past. They followed her, haunting her, filling her with regret and longing. She had dreamed of a fresh start, of escaping from the world that had once defined her, but she hadn't been able to outrun the damage that had already been done. One evening, she stood in front of her small bathroom mirror, her face a reflection of all that had been broken. Her skin was pale, the bags under her eyes a stark reminder of the nights she had spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had done the right thing. The girl who had once stood in front of a church congregation, reciting verses with a smile, seemed so far removed from the woman who stared back at her now. Her hand trembled as she reached for the old family photo she kept tucked into her drawer. The picture of her parents, her siblings, all of them together in front of the house they had once called home. The faces smiled back at her, a glimpse into a time before the world had swallowed her whole. She had been someone else then, someone who still believed that life could be simple, that things could be good. But that girl was gone now, and sometimes she wondered if the past could be reclaimed, if she could ever return to the person she had been. It was on one of those nights, when the loneliness felt unbearable, that she heard a knock on her door. It was late, past midnight, and she had been in the midst of one of her usual late-night phone calls to her mother. Rachel had been trying to hide the cracks in her voice, trying to pretend that everything was fine, even though she knew her mother could hear the lie in every word. She couldn't face it anymore. She couldn't pretend that her life had turned out the way she had hoped. She put down the phone and walked cautiously to the door, her heart beating a little faster with each step. Who could it be? The neighborhood wasn't the safest, and at this hour she wasn't sure what kind of person would be knocking on her door. But when she opened it, she wasn't expecting to see him. Richard! Her breath caught in her throat, her mind scrambling to process what was happening. "Rachel," Richard said, his voice low, almost apologetic, though there was an edge to it she hadn't heard before. He was standing in the dimly lit hallway, his expression unreadable, a suitcase in his hand. "Can we talk?" She didn't know what to say. She wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him to leave and never come back, but she couldn't. Something inside her, something deep and painful, urged her to listen. She had ignored the warnings before, had ignored the truth that had been staring her in the face, but now she was too tired to run from it. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm here to make things right," he said, the words heavy, laden with an honesty she hadn't heard from him in a long time. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, and I can't undo the past, Rachel. But I can't keep pretending either." Her mind spun. How could he just show up like this? After everything that had happened, after all the lies and the manipulation, how could he stand there now, asking for redemption? But there was something in his eyes, something that told her he had in some way realized the cost of his actions. For a moment, she wondered if he truly meant it. "I don't know if I can believe you," she whispered, her chest aching with emotion. "You took everything from me, Richard. You took my dignity, my self-respect. You took my life." He didn't argue. Instead, he lowered his head, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his own words had finally caught up with him. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm sorry." The apology hit her like a wave, drowning her in the emotions she had buried so long ago. The tears came unexpectedly, her chest tightening as she tried to breathe through the pain. For a long time, they just stood there in silence, neither of them knowing what to say next. The man who had once held power over her, who had made her feel like she was nothing more than a commodity, now seemed so small, so lost. "I've been trying to run away from my own mistakes," Richard finally said, breaking the silence. "But I've realized that running doesn't change anything. I can't change the things I've done to you, but I can't keep hurting people either. I came here because I owe you the truth. I owe you something more than what I gave you before." Rachel wiped the tears from her eyes, her body trembling. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said quietly. "But I've learned something from all of this. Something I couldn't see before." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and guilt. "What have you learned?" "I've learned that it's okay to want more. But the more I wanted, the further I pushed myself from the person I used to be. I've learned that you can't escape who you really are. You can run from the life you don't want, but the past will always follow you." She stepped back, her hand still resting on the door, her heart beating heavily in her chest. "I can't go back to what I was. I've changed too much. But I don't want to be like you, Richard. I don't want to keep living in this lie." He nodded, understanding now what she had meant all along. "Then don't," he whispered. Rachel closed the door gently behind her, her body still shaking. But something inside her had shifted. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had taken a step forward. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't an instant solution. But it was the first honest step she had taken in what felt like years. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt like a blanket, soft and comforting. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like it was hers to shape. There were still nights when the loneliness threatened to swallow her whole, when the temptation to go back, to pick up the phone and call Richard became almost unbearable. But each time, she reminded herself that the past could not be rewritten. She had to learn to live with what she had done, and to finally make peace with it. Rachel stood in front of her window, looking out at the city that was still unfamiliar to her, but now, in some small way, it felt like home. There was no going back. But there was still hope. There was still a chance to rebuild the pieces of herself she had lost along the way, and that at least was enough for now.
Is it ever too late to change? How do we learn to forgive ourselves when the past won't let us go? Can someone ever truly escape the life they've created, or do they simply learn to live with it? What does it take to leave behind everything you've known and start over? Rachel stands at the window, her reflection merging with the view of the city skyline, a world that once felt too large, too overwhelming, now feeling oddly peaceful in its stillness. The journey she's been on, through darkness, temptation, and regret, has led her here, to this moment of clarity. The past can never be erased, but she's learning to live with it. She's learning to accept herself. Sometimes, it's not about erasing the mistakes we've made or running from the things that haunt us. It's about understanding that no matter how far we've fallen, there's always a way back, a way to heal, to rebuild, and to begin again. It takes time, and sometimes it takes more strength than we ever thought we had. But it's never too late to turn things around. It's never too late to fight for a better version of yourself. The darkness is always there, lurking in the corners, ready to pull you back. But each day that you choose to step into the light is a victory. Rachel's story isn't just about survival, it's about redemption. It's about finding the strength to face what we've done, to come to terms with the consequences of our actions, and to make the choice to live differently. And in the end, it's about remembering that who we were doesn't have to define who we become. Moral lessons. 1. The past doesn't define your future. You may carry the weight of your past decisions with you, but that doesn't mean they have to dictate the person you will become. Every new day is an opportunity to choose a different path. 2. It's never too late to change. No matter how far down the wrong road you've traveled, you always have the power to change direction. It won't be easy and it may take time, but redemption is always within reach. 3. True strength lies in the courage to start over. The hardest part of healing isn't the pain, it's the decision to try again, to rise up after everything that's tried to keep you down. That is true strength. 4. The people you hurt can forgive, but you must first forgive yourself. Rachel's journey wasn't just about reconciling with others, it was about reconciling with herself. You cannot find peace until you're at peace with who you are, flaws and all. 5. The real reward is inner peace, not external validation. The money, the luxury, the attention, they fade away. But the peace you find in knowing you've done right by yourself and the people you love is a reward that lasts forever. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for taking this journey with Rachel. Her story is one of redemption, of finding hope in the darkest of places. If you've ever struggled with your own demons, with the weight of your past, I hope Rachel's story reminds you that there's always a way forward. You are not your mistakes. You are not your past. Remember, if you feel lost, it's never too late to change. Don't let fear stop you from becoming the person you were always meant to be. If this story has touched you, if it made you think about your own life, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories of redemption and growth. And remember, subscribing is free. It just takes a click, and it helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Take the time to share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes all it takes is one person to start their journey of change. Thank you for being a part of this. Keep moving forward. You've got this.